After the end of the First Cold War in the late 1980s, early 1990s, all of the political West radicalized. It believed that it was the only model. We had globalization and so on. 30 years later now, we're witnessing this internal dissolution of the political West, in part, as I said, because it's undermined its own political and social foundations. At the same time, it is facing major geopolitical challenges. But the thing is that these geopolitical challenges are in part an invention of the political West itself, a symptom of its own intellectual bankruptcy.
Hello, Professor Sakwa. It's a great honor for me to be your host in our TV program. You mentioned the concept of cancel culture in your latest book, The Culture of the Second Cold War. Nowadays, we see that the cancel culture, we observe cancel culture on the level of international relations, where some states just cancel other ones and do not recognize their subjectivity at all. And the West brings, I would say, absolutism in the geopolitics. Does history know this kind of awkward situation we are living in today?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and obviously a great pleasure to be here in Georgia. And indeed, your question is very much applicable, obviously, to the dilemmas facing a country like Georgia. But let me step back a little bit and perhaps provide a bit of context. That cancel culture, and indeed the whole association of that type of conducting politics in that way, which means repudiating dialogue, repudiating diplomacy, repudiating the genuine sense that there will always going to be differences between states, and diplomacy's work is to mediate between difference. And what cancel culture in the international political sphere suggests is that there is only one way, and that's our way. And therefore, not only can you not engage with the other is in some ways illegitimate and even to the point evil. And therefore, all measures are applicable to undermine it, including sanctions, including interference attempts to mobilize domestic forces through NGOs and funding for these sort of civil society organizations to achieve regime change. But the context, obviously, is today, why has all of this come to a head so intensely? And the way I now see it is that we're coming towards the end of a particular historical phase, and that is the whole post-war years. And by post-war, I mean since 1945. And in 1945, we saw the establishment of the shape of international politics as it is to this day. Obviously changed, evolved in so many ways. But let me give the basic model. On the one hand, in 1945, we established a new international system. I call it the Charter International System, based in the United Nations, based on the attempt to overcome the terrible war which the world had just suffered, the Second World War, in which everybody suffered, which, in other words, a European conflict, of course, with Asia, Japan involved, but which became global. So we established this Charter International System. We learnt from the failures of Versailles system in 1919, the Congress of Vienna, all the way back to Westphalia. At the same time, after 1945, two major models of world order emerged. On the one side, you had the Western, US-led model, liberal, if you can go to, it was liberal globalism, with its roots, of course, earlier to Woodrow Wilson and so on. So liberal globalism. On the other side, you had the Soviet model, which was a model of Soviet or socialist internationalism, but of course it also became a model of Soviet globalism. I distinguish the international system is based on sovereign internationalism, independent states, today 193, they have matured, we've had decolonization, the empires have mostly collapsed, but the United States, and through the Atlantic power system, NATO, European Union, re-established a type of liberal empire. It established this empire. Of course, it had a many positive side, a commonwealth goods, public goods as well, but it also had a coercive military side. After 1989, the Soviet model of world order disappears. This Western liberal globalism claims to be universal. We had globalization, we had claims of a universal global Monroe Doctrine that no one can do it. And of course, this, this liberal globalism established this political West, as I call it, collective West, a rules-based international order, if you like, liberal international order. Let's call it the political West. Today, this political West is beginning to dissolve, both because of challenges from outside, Russia, China, India. They don't want to do it. Why should we follow your rules, your model of civilization? We have our civilizations, we have our culture, we have our habits and lifestyles. On the other side, we have internal division, and in which this political West undermines its own normative foundations. And democracy has become so often democratism. We saw it in Romania at the end of the autumn. We see it in Georgia today. You had an election. I won't comment on the actual detail. Of course, I think that the result was contested, but the contestation, even if it had been the most perfect election in the world, it would still be contested because it was the wrong result from this perspective. Hence, you have the mobilization of forces, some of them very genuine. I'm not saying it's simply working from the outside in a genuine sense, but this is where we are. And just one final point on all of this is that it really does mean that a country like Georgia is caught at the time in which this geopolitical contestation between the political West, a decaying political West, and the alignment from outside, Russia, China, and so on, is intensifying. Meanwhile, the degradation process within the political West is accelerating. So it's a double trap. So you could be caught in the geopolitical contestation, or you could then be sucked into the vortex of the degradation of the internal normative standards of our own democracy. Let me just give one example. In the United Kingdom, we have a government, a Labour government under Keir Starmer, which explicitly says that it is to be opposed to NATO is incompatible with Labour Party membership. This is amazing because the Labour Party was always a movement in which the peace movement and anti-militarist movement was a core constituent. That is no longer legitimate. And that's an example of what I say, of the degradation.
The same for the Greens in Germany.
Exactly, which we used to think was a peace party. And indeed, even larger than that, the European Union is beginning to change from being a welfare policy and so on to becoming a warfare polity.
We will touch this topic later. Yeah. The second Cold War, as you call it, differs from the first one by the absolute mistrust between the global powers. There is no trust anymore between them. What's the ways to, I would say, bring back this trust, how to overcome this hurdle? Because the trust is the basis for the global peace and security.
If I knew the answer to that question, I would patent it and become a millionaire. But you're absolutely right. It's trust, but also trust in the institutions of diplomacy and dialogue. And I would actually go a little bit further than you. Its trust is obviously important, but also respect. Respect for diversity, respect for the other, to say you have legitimate concerns. We don't agree with you, but we still respect your beliefs. And that was in the first Cold War. It was, even though, communism versus capitalism.
There was a number of treaties between the parties, yeah.
Absolutely. There was always a level of respect, even to the point of respect for their national interests, security interests, and so on. In the second Cold War, it is much more pervasive, much less clear. People are saying, what are you talking about, a Cold War? Communism versus capitalism. And now they try to say it's democracy versus autocracy. But are we a democracy in Britain? Of course we are. But are we really a qualitative social democracy? That is being undermined the fact that we have, under present conditions, so many parts of the country which feel excluded from the political community, and this is why we have this upsurge of populist movements and so on. So our constitutional rules, which I respect, which I want to see developed more, have been undermined internally. So, but this Cold War is more dangerous than the first Cold War because it's so pervasive and complex and slippery.
There is no touching points of the parties to agree something or something.
Well, certainly the political West has become what I call hermetic, closed. So I'm now reading, for example, the autobiography of Angela Merkel, a very respected German chancellor from 2005 to in the early 2021, 2022. And her book is called Freedom, 700 pages long. So, someone has to do it. And, but, in reading that, I've, learned to respect her more than one would in the past. At the same time, to understand her profound limitations. And it's exactly what you've just mentioned, that she lives in her own reality, this world, and they simply could not understand why Russia or even China have their perspectives, or India even, or anybody outside of this hermetic bubble. It's closed, and that is so dangerous for your own self-image, for our political West. So I'm not opposed to the West. I'm a Westerner. I want to see it develop. I want Georgia, I want all of us to live in community. So the big answer ultimately is to make the charter system, the United Nations system, work as it was intended. And don't forget, the United Nations, obviously the United States played a big part in it, but also so did the Soviet Union and China, and even India was a founder member, even though it was still a colony. So in other words, it genuinely was an expression of the best hopes of humanity. And that includes respect for the Security Council, for all of its members. Today, of course, we used to have the United States, Britain and France voting as a bloc, more often than they should, and Russia and China also aligning. Instead of which, can I just introduce one more comment? The idea of comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, which is cooperation between the powers, the great powers in the Security Council, other powers as well, to build on the foundation of sovereign internationalism. I respect your interest, you respect mine, we then work a way to find dialogue.
But the spirit of the UN is almost lost, this.
Can I just say that it is under the greatest threat than it has been in 80 years, but it is not lost. The United Nations is far from perfect. It is certainly not a world government, yet without it, it would be catastrophic. It really would be a global anarchy. At the moment, we know what international law is. Of course, all the powers observe it in the breach, as we would say, but without it, it really would be a free-for-all. It would be the Wild East.
Wild East, okay. Yes. How do you see the rift in transatlantic relations? Is it real process, or it's just labor division on geopolitical level? Europe will take on Russia, and US will take on China. How do you see this?
No, I don't say it in those terms. I think that this political West, or this Atlantic power system, which established after the war the rules-based order, it was always an artificial construct, in part because of fighting the Soviet Union in the Cold War. It came established bloc unity. And then it continued after 1989-91, the end of the first Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So what we're seeing today, and it was, people like Obama always said, Barack Obama, he said, look, we have to concern ourselves with Asia, the pivot to Asia, that why is this alliance system so dominant when the reason for its establishment has disappeared? So unfortunately, they did not ask the right questions at the beginning of at the end of the Cold War. Why do we still need NATO, for example, when the adversary has gone? Then now we see Donald J. Trump emerging. He is asking the right questions. Not saying he's given the right answers, but he's asking the questions that should have been asked 30 years ago. And so this division now is something that we should have seen. And of course, the Europeans have also been saying that they needed strategic autonomy, and they're saying that for 10 years. And also, well before that, we have the Gaullist vision, which is of Europe as a separate power, working with, all of this, by the way.
Yeah, Macron tried this way, but
Macron,
it was just discourse.
Macron did it before lunch. After lunch, he had a second position. And after supper, he had a third position. And all three were then reversed the following day. In other words, Macron would say 20 different things, depending on the time of the day. So I've absolutely lost any confidence in the coherence of his positions. Each time he says them with great violence and intensity, but they're meaningless, they're empty words. And this is the most dangerous thing, is that Macron has turned into a drum making a lot of noise with no substance, and it's very dangerous. And so Starmer as well, who speaks a series of cliches. We need really, and compared to them, Trump is a model of eloquence and intelligence because he's actually asking the right questions, also saying some of the right answers. Obviously, NATO enlargement is at the root cause of the Ukrainian war. He says it. Stoltenberg, the former head of NATO, says it. But the Europeans are still in denial and says, no, Russia wants to reestablish its empire. That's not the root cause. Of course, the appetite grows with the eating.
Okay, let's talk about the militarization of Europe. We saw the announcement of Ursula von der Leyen, also Keir Starmer, several days ago. Does Europe has capacity to remilitarize itself? And is it directed to the future global conflicts, or is it just internal political theater to sustain this political status quo in Europe?
All of the above, yes. All of those factors play a part in it. Whether it's sustainable, of course, you can always squander billions on arms, and how they're going to do it, this is a tragedy. Because Europe, as we saw from the Draghi report, Mario Draghi's report at the end of 2024 about European competitiveness, and it's not an abstraction. We've fallen behind in artificial intelligence, we've fallen behind in electric vehicles, it's beginning to catch up, or on microprocessor development. And indeed, in developing our own urban and other housing infrastructure. And for the societies, if you look at Deutsche Bahn, Deutsche Railways, how it's, lack of investment. And so if the European leaders believe that military Keynesianism is the answer, yes, it is an answer. Is it the right answer?
But
I would say no. When the social needs are so enormous that the standard of living of so many Western nations for the last 20 years since the global economic crisis, and of course the squeezing of the middle class for 40 years as the technology has changed from the old Fordist, the old industrial model that is moved to a service economy and a more precarious labor market and so on. We've seen the standards of living, stagnating for so long, and indeed, healthcare systems under challenge. We have huge challenges, instead of which the global north is planning to shift onto an old-fashioned anachronistic model, which is totally inappropriate to the challenges of our day, which should really be an agenda based on sustainable peace and development.
The political center in the Europe radicalized in later years. It happens because of internal struggles, or because of geopolitical changes, or because of U.S. Relative retreat from the Europe in general. How do you see this?
It's a double process. After the end of the First Cold War in the late 1980s, early 1990s, all of the political West radicalized. It believed that it was the only model. We had globalization and so on. 30 years later now, we're witnessing this internal dissolution of the political West, in part, as I said, because it's undermined its own political and social foundations. At the same time, it is facing major geopolitical challenges. But the thing is that these geopolitical challenges are in part an invention of the political West itself, a symptom of its own intellectual bankruptcy. By that I mean that if you look at the development of India and China, they are not directed against the West. That, of course, there's competition.
BRICS in general.
They're just developing countries finally taking their rightful place in the world. Yes, there are geopolitical tensions in South China Sea. We know all of those things, but they can be managed. And instead of which, the West, in particular the United States, but European Union has not been helpful. The British, as always, they see a fire and they put more fuel on it, which is the British way of doing it, and it makes them look very important when they then talk about it. And of course, they will come and say to the Ukrainians or the Georgians, we'll come to save you. When the British come to save you, you know you're doomed. But the point is, in other words, they're exploiting these conflicts, like, for example, Taiwan, to weaken Taiwan, and it's been accepted since the 1970s. It's a one-state idea that, that China is with two and many different expressions of that state. Why are we then exacerbating and intensifying the Taiwan issue? We want Taiwan, of course, to remain a prosperous, democratic society. Of course, we want that. We respect the Taiwanese, but we also respect the fact that, of course, Taiwan was established, also believes in the one China as the Republic of China. So this is a complexity, but the Western powers have come in, blundered, if I may say so, and have exploited these divisions to the detriment of all. Now, China is obviously a very proud, sometimes a very prickly and difficult partner, but on the other hand, we should respect its interests, criticize it when it's necessary, but don't militarize it. And that's, of course, what we're doing.
And one last question. How do you think can Western civilization reinvent itself and be a fair part of the world in the future?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, because it's something which I've been thinking a lot. If I may give my little model on all of this, that I mentioned the political West, and this is a socio-political formation, which of course became neoliberal and became more aggressive after the end of the Cold War. But it's been lasting for about 80 years, this thing. But at the same time, it is part and taking the traditions of the 500-year history of, that's the political West, of the civilizational West. And this civilizational West for 500 years has been a colonialist, imperialist, genocidal force. I'm thinking of the Aztecs, Incas, Caribbean people, of course, the slave trade. It's had a genocidal element to it. It's also the civilizational West, the West of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, and so on. It's a complex formation. But today, with debates, and you started with cancel culture. Cancel culture is also trying to come to terms with the West's own colonialist past. Endless talk of decolonizing the West, and it's also the contradictions of its own civilizational West. So those contradictions I've just entered. So that's the second West, if you like. Then, of course, and this is an answer to your question, there is then what I would call a cultural West. This goes back to the beginning, the Judeo-Christian, Romano or Greco-Romano civilization, which was born in interaction with other civilizations, the Persians, the Indus, before the Christian era even, and then of course as part of the Christian development later on. And this cultural West, including above all, for me, as a Neoplatonist, the great height and the dialogues of Plato and so on, as a political method, and the genius of Aristotle and the brilliant historical analysis of Thucydides. That's our European West. And you say, can we then reinvent ourselves? Yes, by drawing precisely on that tradition, to use our cultural things. And of course, then we must understand that cultural side developed in interaction with the Indus and the Sinaic and the other civilizations at that time, and so therefore it is not an ideology or culture of civilizational superiority. It's a culture of civilizational pluralism, and on that basis, I think we can reinvent ourselves as a more pluralistic, a more tolerant, more dialogical culture. If we come back to our own deeper, our own, if you like, not just intellectual traditions, but our deeper spiritual traditions. And that is how we can become a peace and development project rather than a war and de-development and barbarization culture.
Let's go back to classics. Yeah.
Absolutely, back to the classics.
Thanks, Professor.
Forward to the classics.
Oh, maybe.
Yes. Indeed.
Thank you, Professor Sakwa. It was nice to talk to you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks very much.